This is the Sacred Isle, my first ever mega build from back in 2020. Its completion marked the true beginning of my career as my first build that ever got attention online. This was just the beginning in a series of builds that were the main focus on my channel for the next 2 years, but there was one massive issue with all of them. They sucked. I had spent years working in this world, and in the end, I was disappointed by it. My perfect vision of all 3 builds was a far cry from what I actually managed to create due to my poor building skills, leaving me to abandon the world in 2022, never to return again. And yet, those builds continued to bother me. To this day, I can't help but look back and wonder, what if I had been good enough to properly bring my perfect vision into reality? Today, I'm here to prove that I'm a better builder than I was all those years ago. I'm here to put this incomplete part of my career to bed by finally remastering my oldest Minecraft builds. Of the 3 builds that I wanted to remaster, I decided to start with what I believed to be the easiest one, the Frozen Fortress. The first issue I needed to tackle were the mountains. They clearly needed more interesting shapes and more color to them. Using the building mod GoBrush, I began work on the new mountain range, but as this was my first time using this terrain tool, this first attempt ended up being way too vertical, so I had to start again. This time, I gave each mountain more room to breathe, making them shorter and wider at the bases to look more natural. I also left plenty of flatter ground between all the mountains to make room for the fortress itself. However, the terrain was left extremely messy, so I had to spend a lot of time combing over these mountains to clean them up and make them look smoother. I didn't want to use plain old stone for the mountains again, so for the redesign, I planned on using a gradient, making the bottom of the mountains darker than the top. The building mod Go Paint that I had just recently learned allowed me to paint gradients across massive areas with ease, which is what I used to paint the mountains. It was really slow work as the brush only allowed me to use 5 blocks in the gradient, so I had to separate the mountains into different layers and paint them in separately. If you're caught up with the creative mode building scene, you might be wondering why I'm not using the popular building mod Axiom, which would have made this a whole lot easier. That's because this build is from summer 2023, before Axiom even released. This video has been on the back burner for just a little bit. Once the mountains were properly colored, I added smooth snow layers across the more gentle slopes, and immediately we can tell that this is a huge upgrade from the original. But our terrain here was still missing some important details. The old Frozen Fortress had pine trees and large icicles scattered across the landscape, which were still missing from my remaster. I got started on the trees first, whipping up some pine trees that were a lot larger than the old ones to fit in with the new scale of the build. I painted them across the island, which already made the terrain feel a lot livelier. The icicles were gonna give me a little bit more trouble though. Instead of doing singular spikes sticking out of the ground, I decided to do larger clusters of ice spikes, making them look more like crystals, and they immediately looked way cooler than the old ones. Already, it's probably easy to tell how much better I've gotten since the first build. Apart from the massive difference in terrain work, the trees and ice spikes were just clearly a huge upgrade. But the fact is, this was the easy part. I had to build the Frozen Fortress itself, and after that, the Ice Dragon. My main complaint with the old fortress is the use of the prismarine palette, as it made the build feel less icy than I originally envisioned. So for the new design, I ditched the prismarine blocks and plan to experiment with a pure blue and white block palette. I outlined where I wanted all of the different rooms and buildings of the castle to be, making my way up the mountain. I was using gold and redstone blocks temporarily for the time being, which ended up looking like a giant Winnie the Pooh lying on the ground, so that was cool. With the structure of the castle complete, I began to add to the buildings with more detail. I slowly made my way up from the bottom of the castle, and I was pretty happy with the direction it was going in. I struggled a bit with the upper areas of the fortress. There was a lot of empty space on these walls to fill, but I ended up getting something that I thought was decent. But when it came time to color it, things started to fall apart. I struggled a lot to find a color palette that I liked. I literally was here for days trying to figure it out. No matter what I picked, something about the entire thing felt off, like it somehow didn't fit in, and I finally realized what the issue was. I had made the same exact mistake I did all those years ago by not making the fortress feel icy enough. I wanted something more akin to Elsa's ice castle, and this just wasn't doing it for me. So I completely scrapped it and restarted from zero. For the new castle, I spent a lot more time breaking up the uniform square shapes of the castle that the last attempt had too many of. I added uneven clumps of quartz with diorite walls to emulate an icy look. Overall, this new design had a lot more detail than the old one, and it felt like it fit the snowy environment way better. To separate the layers of the castle, I added a massive curved platform for the upper areas to sit on, where I then continued building upwards layer by layer. Once I capped off the fortress with a final tower, I added more ice crystals across the entire castle and gave it a blue and white color. And once it was done, I realized that I had unintentionally made the castle have a skull face in the middle of it, which I think is pretty neat. With a final stroke of inspiration, I added large magenta glass spikes surrounding the castle to make it pop a little bit more, which I think was a very nice touch. With the terrain finished and the fortress complete, there was still one piece of the build I needed to remaster: the Ice Dragon, who had claimed this island as its home. The old dragon design was very clearly too small, which didn't allow me to properly detail an organic creature like this. But because the scale of this remaster is so much larger, I had a lot more space to work with on the new dragon. At first, I wanted the dragon to have an interesting dynamic pose, and I began to outline it with that in mind, but I realized after finishing the outline for the dragon that I simply wasn't skilled enough to make such a dynamic pose look good. After all, the only other dragon that I had built at this point was Farash, and it was a very different dragon to what I was doing here. So I began again, going with a much simpler pose that I was more capable of completing. After shaping the body, I was able to reuse the head that I had designed for the last failed attempt, but everything else had to be new. After a lot more work, it felt like this body was actually passable. I added some final touches, such as more spikes that lined the dragon's spine, and gave it the same color that the original dragon had, a light blue body with a white belly, bringing an end to the Frozen Fortress redesign. Overall, I think I succeeded in remastering the original build. I finally felt like I had brought to life my vision from all those years ago. But on the other hand, I still had to sacrifice part of my original vision because I wasn't skilled enough to make it work. And this was the easiest build of the project. Knowing that the next two builds would be way more difficult, and with another project taking up most of my time, I couldn't move straight into the next remaster. So I had to move on, leaving the other two builds to nag at the back of my mind once more. Fast forward 2 more years, and I had just finished up my biggest project of all time. Since I had time on my hands to focus on some other builds, I figured it was time to return and remaster my next build. Out of the original 3, this one was definitely my least favorite: the Wither Volcano. This build suffered from the same problems as the Frozen Fortress: a bland block palette, a boring castle, and overall it was just too small, leading to an underwhelming build. I was determined to turn this build around from being my least favorite by bringing to life my original vision. For the remaster, I decided to start by building the volcano at the center of it all. I know, it's supposed to be a nether build and I'm making it in the overworld. Just trust the process, there isn't enough room in the actual nether. Due to new terrain tools with Axiom and my improved skills after 2 years, I did not struggle with the terrain here nearly as much as I did with the Frozen Fortress. I think the volcano came out looking very nice. I quickly painted the mountain with a shading technique that makes the deeper crevices of the volcano darker, while the more exposed areas are brighter, giving it a nice look. In the first build, I always wanted to add massive spikes coming out of the surrounding walls, but it was such a daunting task in survival mode that I didn't even dare to try it. With Axiom, however, I was able to quickly add the spikes that I had always imagined, but once the spikes were actually in place, I realized that I didn't like how it was turning out, and I needed a new idea. My next idea was to make default nether-styled terrain super scaled to fit the area, but this didn't really work either. I spent a long time working on these terrain concepts, and in the end, I just had to scrap it all. I eventually realized that the primary issue was that I was trying to enclose the entire build with walls, I finally experimented with an idea to remove the walls and cover the ground in massive spikes, with large cracks of magma tearing across the lower terrain. And I immediately loved this concept, so I began to cover the entire floor of the nearby area with these massive spikes, even adding smaller volcanoes to spice things up here and there. But for some silly reason, I decided that this terrain needed to stretch across 4,000 blocks, which was definitely way more than necessary for this build. This decision would end up costing me big time later on. Literally. Creating this terrain took hours on its own, but this was only half of the story, because the Nether also needs a roof. My original plan was to place a massive flat roof and then invert the tool that I used to raise terrain in order to lower it, effectively doing the same thing I did with the floor but upside down. But the problem is, the invert tool didn't work how I thought it did. I thought it would allow me to pull terrain down from a ceiling, just like how it pulls up by default, but in actuality, it just digs a hole into the terrain when you invert it. I was a bit concerned at this point, wondering how I was going to build the roof now. But then I remembered that I don't have to. I already have the floor done. I can just copy it, flip it upside down, and voila. It took a long time to copy everything and paste it upwards, but it was better than having to do it all from scratch. Now, I need to figure out how I'm gonna color the terrain, and plain old netherrack is not gonna cut it. I decided to use a shading technique just like I did with the volcano itself. The terrain with a direct line of sight to the volcano would be a brighter red, while the areas without line of sight are darker. I swept across the entire build, painting the floor as I went, which took literal hours, but then I had to sweep across it again to add all of the yellow magma cracks into the floor. But that was only half of the work, since I had the roof to do as well. I didn't want the roof to be the exact same color, so I experimented with making it gray, but I really didn't like it, so I ended up settling on a darker red with gray patches in the upper regions of the ceiling to mimic the bedrock ceiling of the Nether. I can't even begin to explain how long the terrain took. I definitely went overkill with the size of the area I covered because I was so worried about making it too small. But after all that time, it was done, allowing me to move on to the volcanic castle. I wasn't exactly sure what I wanted this castle to look like right away, so I just started placing a lot of shapes around to mark out buildings, hoping that some ideas would spark as I went. But this first attempt felt big and bulky, it just didn't fit the vibe I was looking for. The only part of this design that I did like was this really weird crooked tower, so I saved the design just in case before scrapping the rest of the castle. The next design still didn't feel quite right, so I scrapped this one as well really quickly. I couldn't stop thinking about that weird tower that I built, so I decided to hone in on that idea and make the castle mirror this crooked style more. This approach felt so much better immediately. I was confident that this style was what I was looking for after finishing up the entrance gate. I worked on the right side of the volcano next, adding a massive spike to allow for better shaping around more interesting terrain, before adding a lone tower further up with a collection of spikes at the base. I began to add some buildings to the left side, but I ended up moving some of it all the way across to the right because the organization of the structures felt off. To mirror the opposite side better, I added another large spike on the left to fill up the empty space, and added a large bridge leading to the gate to finish up the structure of the castle, meaning now I just needed to add more detail and color the whole thing. I tested out some concepts for different palettes early on, including some that changed the color of the volcano itself, but I would end up going back to gray. I ultimately decided that I needed more detail before picking out colors, so I worked on that instead. All the details that I added were black or gray, as I wanted a brighter colored base with darker highlights for the castle. As I added more details, I would take breaks to test out new colors, where I realized how limited I was with the block palette here. I couldn't exactly do red because it would match the surrounding terrain, and I couldn't do gray and black because then it would match the same color as the volcano. At this point, orange and yellow was pretty much the only color choice I had, which I ended up really liking since it made the castle feel like it was built from the flames of the volcano itself, bringing an end to the Wither volcano. Just like the Frozen Fortress, I felt like I had successfully improved upon the old design in literally every way. I felt like I was avenging those old forgotten worlds that I stopped playing in, like I was finally putting them to rest after all these years. But there was still one final hurdle, one last build that I needed to remaster. And there was a problem with this one. Of all the builds from back in the day, this was the only one that I was actually happy with. The only one that I was proud of. This wouldn't be a simple case of taking a bad build and improving it. I had to take one of my favorite builds, and make it even better. This was the final test. Was I truly a better builder than I was before? The Sacred Isle was my very first mega build back in summer 2020, and it was also the first build that ever got my channel any recognition. But recently, a new idea came to me out of nowhere, and I finally felt like I had a path to improve upon the original. I started off by outlining a star-shaped island just like the original, but like my other remasters so far, I made sure to make it much bigger and give myself more room. I had always wanted to add more islands to the surrounding ocean, but just as I was getting started on them, a light bulb went off in my head. In the original story for the Sacred Isle, it's not actually a natural island. It was a crest left behind by the gods as they descended from the mortal plane, kinda like the symbol Thor leaves behind when he summons the Bifrost. That's what the island is. To expand on this idea, I wanted each surrounding island to be shaped like a rune from above. But not just any rune. When viewed from above, these islands would spell out the Sacred Isle in the enchanting table language. Now I just needed to mold the shape into proper islands. Preserving the shape of the runes wasn't actually as hard as I thought it would be, and I added some hanging vines and palm trees to finish this island, but I wasn't sure about the color just yet. But this was just one island, I still had to finish all of the others. I began to make my way around each island, doing my best to make them look nice while preserving the general outline. This island ended up being one of my favorites because of the interesting shape and the waterfall that I implemented. I added a lot of archways and overhangs, and I'm just really happy with how the structures of the islands turned out. This one was another one of my favorites. I can't even tell you why, it's just satisfying to look at. With all of the runes complete, it was finally time to decide on a color. First, I added some grass to the top layers of the islands and tried out a sandy colored gradient for the rock. But it wasn't a normal gradient. Instead of coloring from top to bottom, I colored based on the angle of the cliffs. This gives the dispersion of the gradient a much more interesting look, and molds to the terrain better. This was a much more time-consuming way to color the islands, but I still finished them up pretty quickly. And they all preserved the runic shape from above. Moving back to the main island, I needed to terraform the large gorge that separates the center pillar from the main island. I wasn't sure about how I wanted to do this at first, and messed around with a few concepts before settling on something simple. Instead of just having a perfectly cylindrical cliff face like the original, I added a lot more shaping and overhangs to the cliffs, and inverted the shape of the center pedestal from the first build. I colored the cliffs using the same angle technique as the outer islands, only with a lot more color this time, before adding the palm trees to the island and adding a grass and flower pattern to the surface. One detail I wanted to add to this remaster that wasn't in the original were some massive lotus flowers scattered across the island, so I got to work on designing those next. The shaping itself took some work to get down right, but I spent a while trying to decide on the coloring for the petals. I eventually settled on a darker magenta color with some green leaves at the bottom. Putting them in across the island added a nice splash of extra color. Now, the real reason I wanted to add these lotus flowers was to match the castle redesign. You see, the big new idea for this build that I mentioned earlier was to have the central castle blooming out of a giant lotus flower. I had no idea how to approach this since I've never done anything like it before, so I started by outlining flat petals that I could mold into more interesting shapes later. I wanted the flower to be at a sort of angle so that the petals in the back were higher up than the ones in the front, but when I tried to do this, the size ratio between the differently angled petals was vastly off, so I decided to completely restart. I made the petals shorter and wider this time, which was a crucial difference that already made this attempt feel so much better. From there, I worked inwards towards the center of the flower, angling each new layer of petals upwards more and offsetting them so that they wouldn't perfectly stack on top of each other. After adding a yellow center to the flower, I felt like I finally had a shape that would work. I experimented with a lot of different coloring options since I wanted each layer of petals to be its own color, but this was quite limiting and made it tricky. I eventually settled on making the outer layers a deeper purple, with the exception of the lowest two, which I colored pink and lime to act as leaves at the bottom. With the flower done, I needed to finish the bridge over the gorge, but with the direction of this remaster, I felt like an organic, natural bridge would fit the build a lot better than if it matched the architecture of the castle, as the original did. My first idea were these floating pillars of rock, which I liked the concept of, but I felt like it was off somehow. I tried again, and instead of doing rock pillars, I did lines of smaller floating rocks, and this was the idea that I ended up settling on, coloring it white so that it wouldn't blend in with the other cliffs too much. Finally, all that was left of this build was the main centerpiece, the sacred castle itself. This moment invoked a lot of nostalgia in me. I was in practically the same situation 5 years ago, only this time I felt the pressure to actually produce an excellent build. Back then, at the start of my building career, I felt no pressure to perform. I built strictly for fun without worrying about how it looked. I can't help but look back and feel envious of how carefree I was towards my builds. But I kept building because I enjoyed it, and I've improved a lot since then. Recently, I've realized that I'm not nearly as good as I want to be. Instead of just jumping from one massive project to the next, I want to actually start putting in time to practice and improve. These remasters felt like the first step in my journey to actually improve at building. It feels like before I can move on to actually becoming an excellent Minecraft builder, I have to put these old projects to rest. I have to complete this chapter before moving on to the next. I began to structure the castle, experimenting with an idea that involved floating islands in the back with more of the castle on them, which I didn't really like, leaving me to repurpose the sky islands for a different part of the build. As the structure was filled out and I moved on to detailing, I realized that I finally stopped second guessing every building choice I made. I just found the flow and kept building. This idea had been stuck in my head for over 5 years, and now I was confident in every decision that I made. I reflected on my building career, thinking back to all those low moments where I questioned why I continue to build. Those dark moments where I start to wonder if I even enjoy it anymore. But moments like these, builds like these, remind me why I continue, why I want to keep improving. These moments, the moments where you finally bring to life a vision that sat in the back of your mind for months, they make it all worth it. Nothing compares to the feeling of satisfaction when you step back after a long build and realize I did a good job. And now, here I was again, just like I was for the first time all those years ago. Leaning back and looking at a completed build like this, I instantly remember, this is why I build.